A wooden peg, driven into a barn joint in 1839, was pulled out by researchers nearly 2 centuries later. It was still curved, bent into the same shape it took the day it was hammered home, still holding the same tension that held the joint tight. The timber around it had shrunk and swelled through thousands of seasonal cycles. The peg had moved with it, flexing and gripping, never loosening. Modern concrete foundations are designed to last 50 to 100 years. This peg had already doubled that, and it showed no signs of failure. The builders who shaped it never heard the word engineering. They worked with hand tools, rules of thumb, and knowledge passed down through apprenticeships lasting half a decade. Yet they solved a problem that modern construction still gets wrong. They designed buildings that move. There is a barn in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, that has stood since 1839. It was built by 2 brothers named Philip and David Hahn for a German immigrant farmer named Christian Hensel. The timbers were cut from trees that were already old when the Constitution was signed. The joints were cut by hand with chisels. The pegs that hold those joints together were split from straight-grained hardwood, shaped on a shaving horse, and driven into place nearly 2 centuries ago. That barn is still standing, not preserved under glass, not propped up by modern reinforcement, standing, working, holding weight, shedding rain, moving with the earth beneath it the way it was designed to move, flexing with every frost heave and settling back, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. Meanwhile, the concrete foundation of a house built in 1985 has already cracked. The steel-reinforced parking garage constructed in 1992 is showing signs of spalling, chunks of concrete falling away as the rebar inside corrodes and expands. The commercial building erected in 2003 will need major structural repairs before its 50th birthday. This is not nostalgia. This is engineering. The question is simple enough to ask. Why do structures built with hand tools 200 years ago outlast structures built with power equipment, engineered materials, and computer-aided design? Why do buildings made of wood and stone endure while buildings made of concrete and steel fail? The answer is not what most people expect. It has nothing to do with the superiority of old materials or the decline of modern craftsmanship. It has everything to do with a single word that modern construction often treats as a problem to be eliminated. That word is flexibility. The 1830s Pennsylvania barn builders, inheritors of centuries of European guild tradition, masters of empirical engineering they never formally articulated, solved a problem that modern construction still gets wrong. They designed structures that move. Their joints tighten under load rather than loosening. Their foundations drain water freely and shift with the ground rather than cracking when the ground shifts beneath them. The entire system, from the capstones of the foundation to the ridgepole of the roof, was built to accommodate the one force that every structure on Earth must eventually face: change. To understand how they did it, and what we've forgotten, we need to travel back to a Pennsylvania that no longer exists. A world where 1/3 of the population spoke German at home, where a barn was often the largest building a family would ever construct, and where the knowledge required to build one had been refined over generations and passed down through apprenticeships that lasted half a decade. This is the story of mortise and tenon joints on dry stacked stone foundations. It is the story of drawbore pinning, of tree nails, of the rule of thirds, and the lost art of practical geometry. It is the story of barn raisings that brought 100 men together before dawn and sent them home by firelight with the frame of a building standing where empty ground had been that morning. And it is the story of why that knowledge faded, how techniques that produced structures lasting centuries were replaced by methods designed for speed and economy, built to last decades at best. The barns that remain are documents of a lost world. Their joints are arguments. Their foundations are evidence. And the question they pose is not merely architectural, it is civilizational. What does it mean that our ancestors built for centuries while we build for decades? To understand the Pennsylvania barns of the 1830s, you first have to understand Pennsylvania itself in those years, a place and time that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone living today. The 1830s fell squarely within what historians call the golden age of farming in Pennsylvania, a period stretching roughly from 1790 to the 1840s, when the state's agricultural economy reached a peak of productivity, prosperity, and cultural coherence that would never quite return. The forests had been cleared enough to create vast farmland, but were still dense enough to provide seemingly endless timber. The soil was rich, the markets were hungry, and the families working the land had been there long enough, 3, 4, even 5 generations, to have developed an intimate understanding of local conditions, local materials, and local methods. By 1830, approximately 1/3 of Pennsylvania's population was of German ancestry. These were not recent arrivals. Their grandparents and great-grandparents had come from the Palatinate, from Switzerland, from the Black Forest, and Alsace, beginning in the early 1700s. They had settled in what came to be called the Pennsylvania Dutch country, a translation error that stuck since Deutsch means German, not Dutch, and they had built a world there that was distinctly their own. The geographic heart of this world was the rolling country of Lancaster, Berks, Chester, Lebanon, and Lehigh counties, spreading into York and Cumberland and Dauphin as the generations multiplied. The land rose and fell in gentle hills, cut by creeks and rivers, dotted with limestone outcroppings that would become foundations. The climate was temperate but demanding. Hot summers, cold winters, springs wet enough to turn roads to mud, and autumns crisp enough to preserve meat hung in a smokehouse. This was not frontier country in the classic sense. The frontier had moved west by the 1830s, but it was still rural in a way that modern Americans can barely imagine. A farm was not a residence from which you commuted to work elsewhere. It was an entire world, a self-contained economy, a place where virtually everything a family needed had to be grown, raised, made, or built by the people who lived there. And at the center of that world, more important even than the house, stood the barn. A Pennsylvania farmhouse of the 1830s was typically a modest structure. Families of 8 or 10 lived in spaces that would make a modern studio apartment feel generous. The house was where you slept, where you ate, where you gathered in the evening. But it was the barn that made everything else possible. The barn sheltered the horses and oxen that plowed the fields. It housed the cows that provided milk and the sheep that provided wool. It stored the hay that fed those animals through the winter and the grain that fed the family. The threshing floor at its center was where the harvest was separated from the chaff. The hayloft above was where a year's fodder was stacked to the rafters. The lower level, built into a hillside to provide ground floor access on 2 stories, was where the animals lived in a warmth generated by their own bodies, warmth that rose through the floorboards to keep the grain above from freezing. A barn was not a luxury. It was not an improvement or an upgrade. Without a barn, there was no farm. Without a farm, there was no family. The structure that held everything together had to be built to last, because if it failed, everything failed with it. This is why Pennsylvania farmers invested in their barns the way they did. Typical dimensions ranged from 50 to 60 feet wide and 60 to 120 feet long. These were enormous structures by any standard. The largest buildings most of these families would ever construct, often larger than the churches they attended. And they were built not with the expectation that they would need to be replaced in a generation or 2, but with the assumption that a grandson's grandson might still be using them. That assumption proved correct. Many of them are still standing. The families who built these barns did not approach the task casually. They knew what they were doing because their fathers and grandfathers had known, because the knowledge had been carried across the Atlantic in the minds of men who had spent years learning it. The German guild tradition of the Zimmermann, the timber framer, required 3 to 5 years of apprenticeship with a master, followed by the Wanderjahre, a mandatory journeyman period of 3 to 5 more years, during which young craftsmen traveled from region to region, worked for different masters, and recorded their experience in leather-bound books called Wanderbücher. This was not on-the-job training. This was a system designed to produce masters of an extraordinarily demanding craft, men who understood not just the techniques of timber framing, but the underlying principles that made those techniques work. They knew how to read wood, how to predict its movement as it seasoned, how to choose the right species for the right purpose. They understood Fachwerk, the half-timbering tradition of Central Europe. They knew truss systems with names that have no English equivalents, the Liegender Stuhl, the Standerstuhl, techniques traceable directly to medieval prototypes. When these men or their descendants built a barn in Pennsylvania in 1839, they were drawing on centuries of accumulated wisdom, refined through generations of trial and error, tested in structures that had already stood for hundreds of years in the old country. The irony is that none of this wisdom was written down. There were no pattern books for barn construction in the 1830s. The earliest carpenter's handbook to mention balloon framing, the technique that would eventually replace timber framing, wasn't published until 1857. Knowledge was transmitted through demonstration, through apprenticeship, through rules of thumb that worked even when no one could explain precisely why they worked. The master framer who arrived at a Pennsylvania farm in the spring of 1839 carried all of this in his head. He knew how to lay out a structure using nothing but a compass and a straight edge, working from proportions and geometric relationships rather than measured dimensions. He knew how thick a tenon should be relative to the timber receiving it. He knew how far to offset a peg hole to make a joint that would tighten over time rather than loosening. He knew which wood to use, where, which trees to fell in which season, how long to let timbers cure before cutting the joints. And he knew that the structure he was about to build, if he built it right, would outlast everyone standing there watching. To understand why 1830s barns still stand, you need to understand what holds them together. And what holds them together is not nails. It is not bolts. It is not metal of any kind. It is wood joined to wood through techniques so refined, so precisely calibrated to the nature of the material, that modern engineers are still trying to understand exactly why they work as well as they do. The fundamental joint of timber framing is called the mortise and tenon. In principle, it is simple. A rectangular hole is cut into one timber, and a matching tongue, the tenon, is cut on the end of another. The tongue slides into the hole. The two pieces become one. That description makes it sound almost primitive. It is anything but. A mortise and tenon joint in a Pennsylvania barn of the 1830s was not just a connection. It was a precision instrument, cut to tolerances measured in 1/16 of an inch, designed to behave in specific ways over periods of time, measured in generations. Every dimension had meaning. Every proportion reflected centuries of accumulated understanding. Consider the proportioning system known as the rule of thirds. The tenon's thickness, the dimension that fits into the mortise, was 1/3 the thickness of the timber receiving it. This was not arbitrary. If the tenon was too thin, it would be weak. If it was too thick, it would leave too little wood on either side of the mortise, creating weak cheeks that would eventually fail. 1/3 was the proportion that maximized the strength of both pieces simultaneously. A typical 1830s Pennsylvania barn used posts measuring 8 by 8 inches to 11 by 11 inches. Tie beams, the horizontal members that span the width of the barn and hold everything together, ran 8 by 10 inches to 10 by 12 inches. The tenons cut on the ends of those beams were 2 to 3.5 inches thick, proportioned according to the rule, cut with a precision that seems impossible given the tools available. An early 19th century tie beam measuring 10 by 12 inches would have a tenon 2.5 inches thick, set 2 inches off the face to leave adequate wood on the near side. 3 peg holes, each 1.5 inches in diameter, would be drilled through the joint, spaced at 2-inch and 4-inch intervals from the shoulder of the tenon. Those peg holes are where the real magic happens. Here's a question. How do you create a joint that will stay tight for 200 years when the materials you're working with, wood, will shrink and swell with every change in humidity, every shift in temperature, every passing season for as long as the building stands? Metal fasteners fight this movement. A nail driven into green wood will loosen as the wood dries and shrinks around it. A bolt tightened in summer will bind and potentially crack the wood when winter humidity drops and the timber contracts. Metal and wood move differently at different rates in different ways. Over time, this difference creates loosening, play, failure. But wood pegs move with the wood. The pegs used in timber framing, called tree nails or trunnels, were typically 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches in diameter, split from straight-grained hardwood and shaped to an octagonal cross-section. Oak and hickory were preferred for their strength. The octagonal shape was critical. The points of the octagon engaged the round hole, while the flat sides provided clearance, preventing binding as the peg was driven in. A peg swells when humidity rises, gripping tighter. It shrinks when humidity drops, but the joint shrinks with it, maintaining contact. The peg and the timbers it connects breathe together, expand and contract together, age together. They are made of the same material, responding to the same conditions in the same ways. This alone would be impressive. But the builders of the 1830s went further. They developed a technique that seems almost like a magic trick, a way to make joints that actually tighten under load, that become stronger over time, that use the natural movement of wood not as a problem to be solved, but as a force to be harnessed. The technique is called drawbore pinning. Here's how it works. When the joiner drills the peg holes through the mortise, the receiving timber, he marks the location carefully. Then, when he drills the matching holes through the tenon, the tongue that will slide into the mortise, he deliberately offsets them. Not by much. For a 1-inch diameter peg, the offset is only about 1/8 of an inch in softwood, slightly less in hardwood. The hole in the tenon is drilled that tiny distance closer to the shoulder, the shoulder being where the tenon meets the body of the timber it's cut from. Now imagine what happens when you drive a tapered wooden peg through those misaligned holes. The peg, forced through the offset hole, bends slightly. This bending creates enormous leverage. The peg wants to straighten, and in trying to straighten, it pulls the tenon deeper into the mortise, drawing the shoulder tight against the face of the receiving timber. The joint is not just held in place, it is actively pulled tight, clamped with a force that increases as the peg is driven home. And here's the remarkable thing, that force doesn't fade over time. The bent peg acts as a spring. As the timbers slowly dry and shrink over the following months and years, the curved peg maintains constant tension. Pegs extracted from barns that have stood for 100 or 200 years still show the characteristic curve they took when they were first driven in, still holding the tension that holds the joint tight. Jack Sobin, an architect who has devoted his career to understanding historic timber joinery, worked with structural engineer Jim DiStefano to document this in a technical guide published by the Timber Frame Engineering Council. Their analysis confirmed what the old builders knew empirically. The pre-stress force created by drawboring means that the pegs experience no increase in load until applied external force exceeds the pre-stress. In other words, the joint's structural capacity is never diminished by the drawbore technique, it is only enhanced. This is not primitive construction. This is sophisticated engineering, achieved without formulas or calculations, refined through centuries of practice, transmitted through apprenticeships that lasted longer than many modern college degrees. The joints in a Pennsylvania barn frame number in the hundreds. A typical structure contained 4 to 6 bents. These are the cross-sectional assemblies of posts, tie beams, and diagonal braces that form the building's skeleton, like the ribs of a ship. Each bent was assembled flat on the ground, every joint carefully cut and fitted, every peg driven in with a mallet until the bent was a single integrated unit. Then, on raising day, those bents were lifted to vertical and connected by the long horizontal timbers, plates running along the top, girts along the walls, whose tenons fit into mortises in the already standing posts. The system had built-in redundancy. Most joints carried compression loads, weight pressing straight down, timbers bearing against timbers. In a typical barn frame of 30 by 40 feet, only about 8 joints out of hundreds carried significant tension loads. And those tension joints were the ones that benefited most from drawbore pinning, pulling tight under the very loads they were designed to resist. Every single one of these joints, the hundreds of mortises, the hundreds of tenons, the hundreds of peg holes offset just so base, was cut by hand. The tools were simple in appearance, but demanding in use. A broadaxe with a single bevel blade 10 to 12 inches wide, often with an offset handle to protect the knuckles from the timber being hewn. Framing chisels 1.5 to 2 inches wide. A slick, a massive chisel pushed by hand rather than struck with a mallet, up to 3 inches wide, used for the final smoothing of joint surfaces. A T-auger or boring machine for drilling peg holes. A skilled timber framer working with these tools could produce 2 to 4 hewn faces per day on a major beam. Cutting a single mortise, the rectangular hole that receives the tenon, took 30 to 60 minutes of careful work with mallet and chisel. Making a single peg, split from straight-grained wood and shaped on a shaving horse, took approximately 10 minutes. The precision required was extraordinary. A mortise cut too large would create a sloppy joint. A mortise cut too small would prevent the tenon from seating properly. The tolerances were not written down in tables of measurements. They existed in the hands and eyes of men who had spent years learning to feel when a joint was right, to see when a timber was true, to know by the sound of a mallet strike whether a peg was seating properly. By the 1830s, 2 systems for laying out these joints coexisted in Pennsylvania. The older method, called scribe rule, dated back centuries. Under scribe rule, every joint was individually fitted. A craftsman would use dividers to transfer one timber's exact profile onto its mate, creating joints that were unique to each pair of pieces. The timbers were marked with Roman numeral-like marriage marks, so that each piece could be matched to its partner during assembly. Every joint was effectively custom work. The newer method, called square rule, was becoming standard by the 1830s. Under square rule, all timbers were reduced to a nominal dimension at joint locations, regardless of the slight variations in the timber's actual size along its length. This meant joints could be cut to standard dimensions, making members interchangeable and eliminating the need for trial fitting. It was a form of standardization that dramatically accelerated production, an early industrial principle applied to a craft that remained entirely manual. Both methods produced joints that have lasted 2 centuries, the question of which was better depends on what you value. The bespoke precision of scribe rule, where every joint was fitted to its specific timbers, or the efficiency of square rule, where consistency allowed faster construction without sacrificing quality. Either way, what emerged from weeks of preparation was a collection of massive timbers, each one marked, each joint cut, each peg hole drilled, waiting for the day when the community would gather to raise them. But the frame was only half the system. Below it, invisible from the outside, equally critical to the structure's survival across centuries, lay the foundation. And the foundation was designed according to a principle that seems almost paradoxical to modern builders. The foundation was built to move. The foundations of Pennsylvania barns were not poured. They were not cast in forms or mixed from bags of cement. They were stacked, stone upon stone, without mortar, without adhesive of any kind, in a technique called dry stacking that has been used for thousands of years and is still not fully understood by modern engineers. To a contemporary builder, this seems almost reckless. We pour concrete foundations precisely because we want them to be rigid, monolithic, unyielding. We embed steel reinforcement to add tensile strength. We waterproof the exterior to keep moisture out. We do everything in our power to make the foundation a single, solid mass that will resist any force the earth might exert upon it. And then, inevitably, the earth wins. Concrete has virtually no tensile strength, roughly 10% of its compressive strength. It can bear enormous weight pressing straight down, but any bending, any twisting, any uneven pressure creates tension, and tension creates cracks. Reinforcing steel addresses this temporarily, but steel corrodes. Moisture seeps into the hairline cracks that form in any concrete structure, reaches the rebar, and begins the slow process of oxidation. Rust expands. The expanding steel pushes against the surrounding concrete. Chunks begin to fall off. The process accelerates. A foundation designed to last a century begins to fail in decades. The Pennsylvania barn builders took a different approach. They built foundations that could move. In Pennsylvania's limestone country, stone was not scarce. It lay in outcroppings across the hills, broke loose from creek banks after spring floods, emerged from plowed fields every year like some strange crop that never stopped growing. The builders dug trenches 36 to 42 inches deep below the frost line so that freezing and thawing would not heave the foundation upward, and typically 2 feet wide. They laid large, flat stones at the bottom as a base course. Then they stacked course upon course above it, each layer offsetting the vertical joints of the layer below in an interlocking pattern, the way a child learns to stack blocks. The gaps between stones were filled with smaller, chinking stones, wedged in to stabilize the larger pieces. Large flat capstones across the top distributed the weight of the timber sills that would rest upon them. And that was all. No mortar, no cement, no binding agent of any kind. What holds a dry stacked wall together is gravity and friction. Each stone bears down on the stones below it. The interlocking pattern prevents any single stone from sliding outward. The mass of the wall, 2 feet of solid stone, provides stability that no thin, rigid structure could match. But the real genius is in what happens when the ground moves. Frost heave is a relentless force in Pennsylvania. Water in the soil freezes, expands, and pushes upward. In spring, it thaws and the ground settles, but not always evenly. A rigid foundation, bonded into a single mass, must either resist this movement entirely or crack. There is no middle ground. Resistance requires massive reinforcement. Cracking is failure. A dry, stacked foundation does something else entirely. When frost heave pushes upward, individual stones shift. They tilt, they rise slightly. And then, when the frost recedes, they settle back. Not always to exactly where they started, but close enough. The wall maintains its integrity not through rigid resistance, but through accommodation. It moves with the earth rather than fighting it. The spaces between unmortared stones serve another critical function: drainage. Water flows freely through those gaps. A dry, stacked wall is essentially thousands of tiny drainage channels that never clog, never need maintenance, never fail. Mortared walls trap moisture. That moisture freezes, expands, shatters the mortar, and the cycle of deterioration begins. Dry, stacked walls simply let the water pass through. A foundation documented in upstate New York, dating to 1736, maintained a perpetually dry dirt floor even during major rain events, thanks to a 2-foot gravel trench at its base that channeled water away from the interior. The same principle applied throughout Pennsylvania. Water was not the enemy to be sealed out. It was a force to be directed, channeled, allowed to flow where it would do no harm. Laboratory testing has confirmed what the old builders knew empirically. Dry, stacked walls are sufficiently strong to handle moderate earthquake activity. The same principle explains why Japanese timber temples have survived centuries of earthquakes that have leveled rigid modern structures. Flexible systems dissipate energy. Rigid systems concentrate it at failure points. The combination of flexible joinery above and flexible foundation below created something that can only be described as a living structural system. The barn breathed with humidity changes. Wood shrinks radially 4 to 5% and tangentially 7 to 8% as it dries, and the pegs flex in concert with the timbers they connect. The foundation shifted with ground movement and settled back. The entire structure moved in response to forces that would crack a rigid building and emerged intact year after year, decade after decade, century after century. Modern concrete structures are typically designed for 50 to 100 years. The Pennsylvania barns have already doubled that lifespan, and many show no signs of failure. European timber frames, built with the same techniques, have survived 800 years and more. The Barley Barn at Cressing Temple in England dates to sometime between 1205 and 1235. Japanese timber temples exceed 1,000 years. The difference is not in materials quality. Modern materials are, by most measures, superior to what the old builders had available. The difference is in structural philosophy. Modern construction resists. Traditional timber framing accommodates, and over the scale of centuries, accommodation wins. To understand what it felt like to build one of these barns, you need to understand the rhythm of the year and the nature of the work. Preparation began in winter, when the farm's demands were lightest and the forests were accessible. Trees were felled when the sap was down, not because the old builders understood the chemistry of sugar content and fungal growth, but because generations of experience had taught them that winter-cut timber lasted longer. The logs were dragged out of the forest by horse or ox, hauled to the building site, and stacked to begin the long process of seasoning. The transformation of a round log into a square timber was work measured in days. The log was first stabilized on trestles, heavy wooden supports that held it at working height. A chalk line was snapped along each of the 4 intended faces, marking where the finished surface would be. Then, a man with a felling axe stood atop the log and scored it every 12 to 16 inches along its length, cutting V-shaped notches down to the chalk line. The wastewood between the scores was knocked off with the same axe, leaving a rough, stair-step surface. Then came the broadaxe. The broadaxe was a specialized tool, single-bevel blade, 10 to 12 inches of cutting edge, often with a handle that curved away from the work to keep the knuckles clear of the timber. A skilled hewer stood beside the log, swinging the heavy axe in controlled arcs, shaving the rough surface down to the chalk line in a single plane. The motion was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The same arc repeated hundreds of times, each swing removing a thin curl of wood, the flat face emerging stroke by stroke. A truly skilled man could produce a surface so smooth it seemed milled. The distinctive pattern of shallow scallops left by the broadaxe, still visible on timbers 2 centuries old, was the signature of handwork, each scallop the width of the blade, overlapping its neighbor, marching down the length of the beam. 2 to 4 faces per day. That was the pace. A single large timber might take most of a week to hew. The top surfaces were finished with an adze, a tool like a hoe with a curved blade, swung between the legs toward the body. Joints were laid out using compass and straight edge, the geometry transferred to the wood with chalk or scoring knives. Then the chisels came out. A mortise, the rectangular hole that would receive a tenon, took 30 to 60 minutes to cut. The outline was scored first, then the wastewood removed chip by chip with mallet and chisel. The walls of the mortise squared and smoothed until they met the exacting tolerances the joint required. The slick, that massive hand-pushed chisel up to 3 inches wide, gave the final finish, paring surfaces flat and true. The tenon on the mating timber had to match precisely. Cut too thick and it wouldn't seat. Cut too thin, and the joint would be loose. The fit had to be tight enough that the pieces would stay together without pegs during the chaos of raising day, when dozens of joints would be assembled simultaneously while the heavy timbers were held in position by scores of straining men. And then there were the pegs. Each tree nail began as a billet of straight-grained hardwood, a section of trunk or branch split along the grain with a froe to ensure the fibers ran the full length of the peg. If the grain wandered, the peg would be weak. Only perfectly riven pieces were acceptable. The billets were shaped on a shaving horse, a specialized bench where the workpiece was clamped by the pressure of the craftsman's feet, freeing both hands to wield a draw knife. Round and round the billet turned, thin shavings peeling away until the octagonal cross-section emerged. 10 minutes per peg was typical. A large barn might require hundreds of pegs. Do the arithmetic. Making pegs alone could consume days of labor. All of this happened before raising day. Weeks of preparation, months of work, timber after timber hewn, joint after joint cut, peg after peg shaped and set aside. The master framer checked each piece, tested the fits, made adjustments. The bents were assembled flat on the ground, pegged together, then disassembled and stacked in order for the raising. And then the day came. We have records of what barn raisings looked like, though frustratingly few from the 1830s specifically. The practice was so common, so unremarkable to those who participated in it, that detailed accounts are rare. What we know suggests gatherings of 75 to 100 men, neighbors from surrounding farms, relatives from the extended family network, hired workers from town, anyone who could be called upon to help and who knew that when their own time came, help would be given in return. They arrived before dawn. The women of the household and neighboring farms began preparing what would be an enormous meal, traditional Pennsylvania German dishes, food enough for a small army. At non-Amish raisings, whiskey was often provided, which contributed to camaraderie but also to accidents. Period newspapers record injuries that chill the blood, fractured skulls, punctured lungs, severed limbs from falling timbers, and pike poles. The work proceeded systematically. The first bent was positioned at one end of the foundation, its base set on the capstones of the dry stacked wall. Men took hold of pike poles, long wooden poles with metal points, and positioned themselves along the top plate of the bent. At a signal, they pushed. Others pulled on ropes attached to the plate. The bent rose slowly from horizontal, the pike poles walking it upward, men shuffling forward as the angle steepened, until, with a final heave, it passed vertical and was caught by ropes on the opposite side. The most dangerous moment was the tipping point. A bent, weighing thousands of pounds, held nearly vertical by the strength of dozens of men, could come crashing back down if someone slipped, if a rope broke, if the coordination failed. Once it passed vertical, the danger shifted. Now it might fall forward, crushing anyone on the far side. Only when the ropes on both sides were taut and the temporary braces were in place could anyone relax. Then the second bent, then the third. Then the connecting timbers, the plates and girts whose tenons fit into mortises cut into the already standing posts. Men climbed the standing bents with the casualness of those who had done this since childhood, walking beams 40 feet in the air, guiding timbers into position, driving pegs home with wooden mallets, while their neighbors below held the massive pieces steady with ropes and pike poles. A frame that had taken months to prepare went up in hours. By late afternoon, or, for large barns, by the end of a second day, the skeleton stood complete. The master carpenter climbed to the ridgepole and placed a green bough, a wreath, or sometimes a small flag at the highest point, the topping out ceremony that marked the completion of the frame. He offered a speech and a toast. The men climbed down, the women brought out the feast. The evening that followed was celebration, music, storytelling, dancing. Young people who would eventually marry met at barn raisings. Disputes between neighbors were set aside for the day. You could not refuse to help a man raise his barn without marking yourself as outside the community. The German word for this web of mutual obligation was Nachbarschaft, neighborliness. But a neighborliness that was not optional. It was the social contract of a world without insurance, without emergency services, without any safety net except the one your neighbors provided. The barn was raised, the frame stood, but weeks of work remained. Closing in the walls, installing the flooring, building the threshing floor, fitting the doors. The structure that had gone up in a day would take most of a summer to complete, and when it was done, it would stand for 200 years. The barn did not exist in isolation. It was one piece of an interlocking system of self-reliance so comprehensive that modern minds struggle to grasp its scope. Consider what a single Pennsylvania farm family of the 1830s had to know how to do. They grew their own grain, wheat, rye, oats, corn, which meant they had to understand plowing, planting, cultivating, harvesting, and threshing. They raised their own livestock, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, which meant they had to understand breeding, feeding, slaughtering, and preserving meat. They made their own clothing, which meant someone in the household had to know how to card wool, spin yarn, weave cloth, cut patterns, and sew garments. They produced their own dairy products, milk, butter, cheese, and their own preserved foods, smoked hams, pickled vegetables, dried fruits, sauerkraut in crocks that would last the winter. They built their own structures, not just barns, but houses, spring houses, smoke houses, corn cribs, chicken coops, fences, miles of fences. They made many of their own tools or maintained the ones they bought from specialists. They doctored their own animals and often themselves. They educated their own children, at least until a schoolhouse was built close enough to attend. The barn was essential because it enabled so much else. Without a place to shelter animals through the winter, there would be no animals in spring. Without a place to store hay, there would be nothing to feed them. Without a threshing floor, the grain harvest could not be processed. Without dry storage for that grain, a year's work could be lost to rot and vermin. But the barn required other things to exist before it could be built. You needed oxen or horses to drag the timber from the forest, and those animals needed to be bred, raised, trained, and fed by other components of the farm system. You needed iron tools, which meant either a local blacksmith or the money to buy manufactured goods, which meant a cash crop to sell, which meant fields already cleared and planted. You needed neighbors willing to help with the raising, which meant you had already helped them with their work, which meant you had time to spare from your own farm's demands, everything connected to everything else. Pull one thread, and the whole fabric shifted. The same interconnection applied to the skills themselves. The man who could hew a timber could also fell a tree, build a fence, repair a wagon, construct a chicken coop. The woman who could spin wool could also weave cloth, sew clothing, make soap, preserve food, manage a household economy that balanced production and consumption across the seasons of a year. Specialization was rare because it was impossible. You could not afford to be good at only one thing when survival required competence at dozens of things. This is the context that makes the barn so remarkable. The same hands that cut those joints also plowed fields, slaughtered pigs, mended harness, and delivered calves. The same minds that understood the geometry of timber framing also understood crop rotation, animal husbandry, weather prediction, and the 1,000 small calculations required to bring a family through a Pennsylvania winter. Modern life has replaced this web of self-reliance with a web of specialization and dependence. We do one thing well and pay others to do everything else. Our food comes from somewhere else, processed by someone else, transported by systems we never see. Our homes are built by specialists we hire, maintained by other specialists when they break. Our clothing is manufactured on the other side of the world. The skills that sustained a Pennsylvania farm family, the comprehensive competence that allowed them to build a structure that would stand for centuries, have been divided, distributed, and largely forgotten. This is not necessarily bad. Specialization has produced efficiencies and advancements that would have seemed miraculous to an 1830s farmer. But something has been lost too. A kind of self-reliance that provided not just practical capability, but a sense of agency, of connection, of understanding how the material world actually works. The Pennsylvania barn builders knew where their materials came from because they had felled the trees themselves. They knew why the joints worked because they had cut hundreds of them, felt the fit, seen what happened when the proportions were wrong. They knew their structures would last because they understood, not theoretically, but in their hands and their bones, every single element that made them stand. How many of us can say the same about the buildings we live in? The Pennsylvania barn was not the only timber-framed agricultural structure in America, but it was distinctive, a regional adaptation shaped by specific cultural traditions, specific materials, and specific environmental conditions. To the north and east, New England developed its own barn traditions, influenced more by English building practices than German ones. The classic New England barn was typically built at ground level, rather than banked into a hillside, with a different interior organization and different framing details. Dutch barns in New York's Hudson Valley had their own characteristic form: broad, low structures with distinctive H-bent framing and wide central aisles. To the west, as Pennsylvania Germans migrated into Ohio, Indiana, and Ontario, they carried their barn-building traditions with them. Ohio developed the highest density of Pennsylvania-style barns outside the Commonwealth itself. The same forebays, the same banked construction, the same timber framing techniques, adapted to new landscapes and new materials. The adaptations were subtle but significant. In regions where limestone was scarce, foundations might be built from fieldstone or even timber sills laid directly on the ground. In areas with different forest compositions, builders selected whatever local species best matched the properties they needed: oak for strength and rot resistance, whatever was light and workable for upper framing. The techniques traveled. The specific execution responded to local conditions. Even within Pennsylvania, variations reflected local traditions and preferences. Ensminger identified 10 subtypes of the standard Pennsylvania barn based on details of forebay construction alone. Some forebays were cantilevered out on extended floor beams supported only by the timbers of the upper level. Others were supported by posts extending down to a lower foundation wall. The differences reflected not just structural choices, but cultural ones. Communities maintaining the specific practices their founders had brought from specific regions of Europe. The decorated barns of Berks, Lehigh, and neighboring counties added another layer of variation. The geometric patterns painted on barn facades, often called hex signs, though historians debate whether they had any symbolic meaning or were purely decorative, reflected Pennsylvania German folk art traditions. The barns they adorned were structurally identical to their undecorated neighbors, but visually they proclaimed cultural identity across the landscape. Climate shaped adaptation as well. The steep roof pitches of the early Schweitzer barns, often approaching 45 degrees Celsius, shed snow effectively in regions of heavy winter accumulation. Flatter pitches became more common as styles evolved and as builders in less snowy areas prioritized other considerations. The south-facing orientation of the forebay, nearly universal in Pennsylvania barns, provided passive solar design. The overhang shaded the livestock level in summer while allowing winter sun to warm the stone walls. These were not conscious design choices in the modern sense. They were accumulated wisdom, refined over generations, encoded in traditional practices that builders followed because they worked. A young carpenter learning the trade in Lancaster County in 1830 didn't ask why barns faced south or why forebays projected 7 feet. He learned to build them that way because that was how barns were built. And behind that tradition lay centuries of trial and error, the successful methods surviving, the failures forgotten. The world that produced these barns did not disappear all at once. It faded gradually as new technologies and new economics made the old ways first optional, then impractical, then impossible to maintain. The first signs appeared even as the Hahn brothers were building the Hensel-Winslow barn in 1839. That same decade, in Chicago, a new construction method was being developed that would eventually make timber framing obsolete for most purposes. The technique was called balloon framing, and its advantages were immediate and obvious. Balloon framing used small-dimension lumber, 2x4s, 2x6s, nailed together rather than joined with mortise and tenon. The skill required was dramatically less. Where a timber framer needed years of apprenticeship to master the layout and cutting of complex joints, a balloon framer needed only to know how to saw lumber to length and drive nails. The tools were simpler, the materials were lighter. A structure that would have required a community raising could be erected by a small crew or even a single family without specialized knowledge. The transformation was made possible by two industrial developments. First, the mechanization of nail production. Jacob Perkins' nail-cutting machine, refined through the early 1800s, could produce 10,000 nails per day, making iron fasteners cheap enough for ordinary construction. Second, the spread of water-powered sawmills producing standardized dimensional lumber, boards of consistent width and thickness that could be used interchangeably. By the 1840s and 1850s, Pennsylvania barns showed mixed construction, hand-hewn principal timbers combined with sash-sawn secondary members. The major structural elements still came from the old tradition, but the smaller pieces were bought from mills. The Civil War accelerated the change. Steam-powered circular sawmills replaced the water-powered vertical mills of the earlier era, cutting timber faster, in longer lengths, in greater volume. Barns from the 1860s and later show the curved marks of circular saw blades rather than the straight marks of the earlier up-and-down sash saws. By the 1870s and 1880s, the barn raising as a community event had become rare outside Amish and Old Order Mennonite communities. Large barns were built by hired contractors using mixed traditional and modern methods. The Zimmerman tradition that had produced masters of timber framing was breaking down. There was no longer enough demand for traditional skills to justify the long apprenticeships, and young men could make easier livings in other ways. By 1900, the Pennsylvania barns era of construction had essentially ended. The barns that stood would continue to stand, maintained by farmers who understood their value even if they could no longer have built them. But new agricultural structures were increasingly built with lighter framing, manufactured materials, eventually steel and concrete. By 1910, plank frame barns were available by mail order from Chicago. What disappeared was not just a construction technique. It was an entire system of knowledge, species selection, practical geometry, the empirical understanding of wood behavior, the community institutions of mutual aid that made raising possible. The Nachbarschaft system required dense rural communities of families who knew each other, who would need each other's help again, who could not opt out of the social contract without marking themselves as outsiders. Urbanization, mechanization, and the slow emptying of the countryside dissolved those communities. Only the Amish and Old Order Mennonites, deliberately holding themselves apart from the broader society's changes, maintained the tradition in unbroken practice. They still raise barns today, still cut joints by hand, still gather communities of 100 or more to lift the frames. They are living repositories of knowledge that everywhere else has been lost. The trade-off is worth contemplating honestly. The old methods were slow. They were labor-intensive. They required skills that took years to acquire, and communities organized around mutual obligation. Balloon framing and its descendants made construction faster, cheaper, more accessible. A family arriving on the Great Plains in 1880 could build a shelter without a master framer, without a community raising, without years of accumulated skill. That mattered. That opened possibilities. But the structures they built would not stand for 200 years. What remains? The barns themselves remain, though fewer each year. Nationally, farms reporting pre-1960 barns declined 28% between 2007 and 2017. And that statistic includes barns far younger than the 1830s structures we've been exploring. Pennsylvania loses more than one farm per day to development. Lehigh and Northampton counties alone lose more than 2,000 acres of farmland annually. Some losses are dramatic. The Kepler Barn in Center County, built in 1880, owned by Penn State since 2006, was demolished in April of 2025 after fundraising fell short of what would have been needed to save it. Priscilla de Leon, president of the Historic Barn and Farm Foundation of Pennsylvania, called it demolition by neglect. Others disappear quietly, a roof caves in after one too many winters, an owner facing expensive repairs chooses to bulldoze rather than restore, a farm is sold, and the new owner has no use for a structure designed for a kind of agriculture that no longer exists. But some are being saved. The Historic Barn and Farm Foundation of Pennsylvania, co-founded in 2007 by Robert Ensminger himself, the Kutztown geographer whose scholarship defined the field, conducts annual barn tours in different counties, raising awareness and offering matching grants to barn owners undertaking repairs. The 2026 tour will focus on northern Berks County's decorated Pennsylvania Dutch barns. Greg Huber, another co-founder, has personally surveyed all approximately 1,700 barns in Lehigh County, documenting what exists before it disappears. The Timber Framers Guild, founded in 1985, has become the institutional home for the revival of traditional timber framing in America. The Guild has completed over 100 community building projects since 1988, runs apprentice training programs, and maintains the accumulated knowledge of the craft through publications, workshops, and gatherings. Their annual conferences draw hundreds of practitioners, some professionals, some hobbyists, all committed to keeping the old skills alive. Individual craftsmen have carried the tradition forward. Steve Chappell began timber framing in 1970 and founded possibly the first new timber framing company since the craft's early 20th century demise. Jack Soban, who entered the field in 1976 while dismantling old barns, has since erected more than 60 structures using only traditional hand tools, often beginning with standing timber in the forest. His Historic American Timber Joinery, a graphic guide funded by the National Park Service, documents the very joints found in 1830s barns, a printed record of knowledge that was once transmitted only through apprenticeship and demonstration. In Pennsylvania specifically, firms like Stable Hollow Construction and B&D Builders specialize in historic barn restoration. Groffdale Barns builds new bank barns with traditional mortise and tenon joinery. Hugh Lofting, working in Chester County since 1974, is described as one of a handful of woodworkers responsible for the revival of the art of timber framing in the United States. Museums preserve what private owners cannot maintain. The Landis Valley Village and Farm Museum in Lancaster County spreads across 100 acres with more than 40 buildings, including a Swiss bank barn and authentic collections of the tools that built it. The Mercer Museum in Doylestown holds over 50,000 pre-industrial tools organized by 60 different trades. Henry Mercer, who assembled the collection, called them the tools of the nation maker. The Library of Congress holds the HABS/HAER collection, freely accessible photographs and drawings of Pennsylvania barns, documented by scholars including Charles Dornbush himself, evidence preserved even as the structures decay. And somewhere in Cumberland County, the Hensel Winslow Barn still stands, the barn built by Philip and David Hahn in 1839, documented in their surviving account ledgers, witness to nearly 2 centuries of Pennsylvania seasons. The question the barn poses is not merely architectural. It is a question about how we build, what we value, what we preserve, and what we let disappear. The 1830s builders created structures designed for time, not for the moment of completion. They used materials that worked with the forces of nature rather than against them. They embedded their structures in systems of knowledge and community that ensured the skills would be passed on. We have largely abandoned that approach. We build for speed, for economy, for the lifespan of a mortgage, rather than the lifespan of a civilization. Our foundations crack. Our fasteners corrode. Our structures require constant maintenance and eventual replacement. The barns remain. They flex with the frost. They shed the rain. Their joints, tightened by the drawboard pegs driven home 2 centuries ago, hold as firmly as they did the day they were raised. They are still waiting for us to ask what they know.